Hello and welcome back to another session on study skills. Today's session is about critical reading. My name's Rizwan Mustafa, and today the aim of the session is to provide you with an understanding of critical reading. And the objectives by the end of this session is that you'll be able to better understand what critical reading is, appreciate some of the techniques used for critical reading, and reflect on your own reading practices. This is important because quite often we are asked to engage with literature critically. We're asked to critically assess, critically evaluate. So what does that mean in terms of our reading and our approach to existing literature? So that's what this session is all about. We're going to start off with a bit of an exercise, and what I'd like you to do is run through the following text with me. Now, this is a very short piece that's been lifted from a much broader document authored by Professor Thomas Hegghammer, who is a expert in the field of terrorism. And this particular article is in relation to Muslim foreign fighters, or the rise of Muslim foreign fighters. And the reason why I've chosen this is because it relates directly to my research field. My PhD was in the self-proclaimed Islamic State, so I spent a lot of time looking at this sort of material. Now, what I would like you to do is take as long as you need to just to read through this text. And when you're ready, read it as you normally would do any kind of text. And when you're ready, move on to the next slide. Okay, so now that we've read that text, and we've read it perhaps as we normally would do, it's a great time to appreciate or understand what critical reading is, or what it's positioned to be. So some of this may seem fairly straightforward, but in the context of how we read a document, its application of those principles. So firstly, critical reading is reading with a purpose and having a goal at the end, intended goal at the end of our reading. So if you've not already looked at the sessions on sources and how to identify credible sources, once you've identified a credible source and what makes it a valid source, then how do you go about engaging with that? How do you go about understanding that? Well, one of the first things to do is read that text with a purpose, and some of that purpose is defined by one of the other presentations that we also delivered, which if you haven't had a look at, it's great to have a look at, titled Understanding the Question. So how you understand the research question in terms of the directive, in terms of the subject matter, in terms of limitations. Once you've understood what the question is, once you've understood who the credible authorities are within that field, now you're in a position where you're ready to read, and that will give you a better understanding of what it is that you're hoping or wanting to get out of it. So that will help you define your purpose. So read with a purpose, and alongside that is exploring different viewpoints on a topic. So previously we read around Muslim foreign fighters, that was authored by Thomas Hegghammer. What are the other opinions in the field? So it's challenging the conventional wisdom, it's challenging the knowledge that's being presented to you, and not necessarily accepting everything on face value, but having a look at alternative perspectives for the text, or in relation to the text that you have in front of you. And featuring within that is, well, how is that text argued? Is it balanced? Is it rational? Is it relevant? One of the considerations that came up in the previous presentations that we've done around the reliability and the validity of sources and information is, well, how relevant is it in relation to the context that you're talking about? And that relevance can be any one of a number of things. And what we'll learn as we move on to the next slide is time. So the research, when it was conducted, is that still relevant today? So judge how the text is argued, and within that, the credibility of the individuals making the argument, and fundamentally making inferences about the text. So what is it saying beyond what it says on paper? So what kind of conclusions or inferences can you draw out from what is being argued, and having a general awareness of the text in relation to other conversations that are happening in the field. And quite often what will happen is that that awareness will develop as a result of your reading other texts. So you'll pick up a piece that's been authored by Thomas Hegghammer, for argument's sake, and you may read it and you may gain some information in relation to that. And then you'll read something else that's been authored by somebody else, for argument's sake, and you'll read that, and that will challenge your understanding of what you read in relation to Hegghammer's text. So that gives you a broader awareness of a particular writing in the context of other pieces of literature that have been written. So broadly speaking, these are the kind of principles of critical reading, exploring different viewpoints, having a focus for it, judging how the text's argued, the credibility argument, inferences, and an awareness and interaction with the text in the broader field of whatever it is that you're reading. In this case, we're talking about terrorism, and we're talking about individuals who happen to be Muslim and engaged in acts of terrorism. Moving on from that, beyond what is the critical engagement argument, critical reading, you've got the critical reading and the critical engagement. So at the end of that, it's trying to understand the author's main argument. So what is their thesis that they're putting forward? And from the brief snippet that we had of Thomas Hegghammer's argument, it was literally, one snippet of a 42-page submission. And what it is at the end of that, if you read all of that, what is it that he's arguing, and from his main argument, what is the evidence that he's putting forward in support of that, and in relation to that, what are the alternative perspectives regarding that argument? So you've got the author's main argument, you've got his evidence that he's put in support of that argument, but what's the other perspective in relation to that? What's the alternative view in relation to that, and what are their evidences in regards to the argument that the individual author in relation to the text that you're reading is putting forward? And critically, how does the piece that you are reading, how does that fit in to the broader literature within the field? So if you've got 10 people arguing one thing, and you've got one person arguing something completely different on whatever field it may be, how much relevance, how much credibility or weight can you afford to that one argument when you've got 9 or 10 opinions to the contrary? And that doesn't necessarily mean that one person's wrong. It just means that they've got a very different opinion, and it's worthy of exploration, perhaps in greater detail. But how does it sit within the broader literature, and why, if it's different, why is it different? Yeah, understanding those things are key. And one of those reasons may be bias. We spoke about this in one of the other presentations that we gave on sources and utilizing resources. Is the author biased? Is the literature biased? Are the sources that are being used to present that argument, are they biased? And if so, why are they biased? And incidentally, those points were taken from Coventry University for the Centre of Academic Writing. So those are the kind of some of the key points of critical reading and engagement. Whenever you engage with a piece or try and understand a piece, try and have those points in mind. At the end of that reading, you're reading with a focus, but at the end of that reading, what's the author trying to say? And once they've said what they've wanted to say, what is the evidence that they've used to support that? And in relation to that evidence, is it biased? How do those arguments fit in with other narratives within the field? And what are the alternative perspectives, either in relation to the individual pieces of evidence that have been used to support the entire argument, or the whole argument that the author is making? Okay, so that's critical reading and engagement in a nutshell. Now, once we've kind of understood that, once we've understood what critical reading is in terms of reading with focus, and all the other points that were raised in the previous slide, and how we engage with a piece of work. Okay, so now that we've had a brief overview of some of the characteristics of critical reading and how you critically engage with literature, let's read that text by Thomas Hegghammer one more time, and I'm just going to bring up some of the key points that were raised in slides 5 and 6 regarding what critical reading is and how to engage with literature critically. Now, I've highlighted a few kind of bits from this text, and again, bearing in mind that it's part of a much broader document. But some of the things that jumped out at me reading this through a theological lens, and it's worth highlighting that Thomas Hegghammer is a political scientist. That's what his kind of background is, and he engages with the phenomenon through that lens. But he mentions here that a salient feature of armed conflict in the Muslim world since 1980. Now, the interesting observation for me here is the Muslim world. Well, how do you define the Muslim world? What is considered to be the Muslim world? Is the Muslim world everything that is not Europe and not America, Canada, what they consider to be or is argued as the West? Is it everything that is in the Middle East? What about the Far East? What about the Indian subcontinent? What about Malaysia and Indonesia and those kind of places? Do they fall in the Muslim world or the non-Muslim world? And how do you then position Muslims who are now a increasing number within the West? How do you position them? Where do you consider them to be? Are they cut off from the Muslim world and possibly Islam within the Muslim world because of their geography? And who makes that determination? Who decides that this is the Muslim world and this isn't the Muslim world? And all of these are relevant considerations, because if I was writing on the rise of Muslim foreign fighters from a theological perspective, which is a completely different lens to what Hegghammer is using to engage with this subject, I would argue that, well, the Muslim world is indivisible. Muslims are Muslims irrespective of where they are within the world, and they are inherently connected through faith, and those arguments lead into sociological arguments, anthropological arguments, identity and belonging arguments. So if I was looking at or critically engaging with one of the factors or causes of terrorism, as historically it has been attributed to why individuals become terrorists, is because they don't have a sense of belonging. So you could argue, well, this kind of presentation is the very us versus them binary that is used by radicals and extremists to recruit individuals into their cause. So it's not entirely helpful if we endorse that position in and of itself. So even though on the surface it may seem like an accepted use of language, accepted terminology or premise that there's a phenomenon known as the Muslim world, and the Muslim world is positioned against the West, but you can begin to see some of the issues and the considerations that stem from that as an inference when you begin to engage with it a bit more critically. Similarly, when you look further on down, for example, when Muslims in the West radicalise, they usually do not plot attacks in their home country right away, but travel to a war zone such as Iraq or Afghanistan first. Now, this perhaps was correct or relevant in 2010 when Hegghammer wrote this piece. But since then, the world's changed drastically with the rise of ISIS, the self-proclaimed Islamic State, there have been a number of individuals who haven't travelled at all to the Middle East, to the self-proclaimed caliphate, and yet have been involved in terrorism and acts of terrorism and terrorist incidents here, not only in the UK but also more broadly across Europe. You need to look at the 2017 Manchester bombing attacks. You've got more recently the London Bridge attacks. Individuals who haven't necessarily travelled to the caliphate, true self-proclaimed caliphate, to the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan, for instance, but yet have still gone on to perform acts of terrorism here. So the relevance, as we mentioned, engaging with the text in a way where you're kind of looking at the evidences that are supported to utilize those arguments, are they still relevant? Because from the time that this piece was written, the world's changed considerably. Although it's only been 10 years, the world's changed considerably, and those arguments aren't necessarily fully representative of the way that reality is perceived in the world now, because we've got individuals who aren't traveling yet still planning attacks and involved in attacks. And fundamentally, a couple of terms here in terms of attribution of labels. We've got jihadi here, we've got Islamist here. And again, if I was looking at this through a theological lens, when I look at some of the theological deconstructions that have been conducted of organizations like Daesh, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, then how accurate are those labels? And even though they may be accepted terminology within the field of terrorism and terrorism studies, how accurate are those labels as descriptors of individuals or groups who utilize the faith of Islam for the purposes of their own causes, whether you want to label them as sectarian causes, political causes, economic causes, whatever it may be. How accurate are those labels when you position those labels against the wealth of literature that exists out there that challenge the very validity of such labels? And in doing so, is there this argument around compounding that otherness narrative that was mentioned earlier on above in reference to the Muslim world, that even though individuals who are Muslim actively try to push themselves away and push the faith of Islam away from acts of terrorism, the labels that are utilized in academia, in mainstream society, seek to associate a terrorism phenomenon with a very personal faith and belief. So from an identity and belonging perspective, there is a whole conversation to be had around that. So you can begin to see that just from a very kind of superficial reading from the first set to a more critical reading, how you can pull out some of the considerations that are evident within a text, and how you can use some of those considerations to highlight issues, if that's the right term to use, with the text that you're reading, or equally to highlight the strengths of the text that you're referring to based upon your critical analysis and engagement of it. And that brings us back full circle to the objectives. So, you've kind of got an understanding of what critical reading is. Some of the techniques that are used for critical reading in terms of engaging with it, questioning with it, drawing inferences from the text. And you've also had the opportunity to read a text as you normally would do, try and take an understanding from that, but then measure that against a critical approach to reading. So reflect on your own reading practices, the way that you normally would read a text. And if you're reading it critically, brilliant. If you're not reading it critically, well, these are some of the pointers that you can try and implement now into your reading to make your reading a little bit more critical. Because when your reading is critical, then your outcome will arguably be more critical as well, which is what's needed for the purposes of academic work and academic research. Okay, now there's a bunch of resources that are out there. I would encourage everybody to go out and utilize them. These slides will be uploaded onto Brightspace for you to click on these links and enjoy the wealth of resource that is out there. And remember, the University of Huddersfield as a great online space. They've got a academic support writing service as well. So make use of that whilst you have the opportunity to. And remember that the library is your academic nucleus, so make the absolute most of it. That's it from me, folks. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop me a line. My email is at the front on the first slide, or alternatively, touch base with any of the academic support team at the university, and we'll try and help you as much as we can. Thank you, and bye-bye.